Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome. I'm Robert Holcomb. I serve as Dean of Language Arts and Academic Foundations. I also serve as co-chair to the Arts and Lectures Committee here on campus, along with Public Safety faculty member Joe Anderson. And so I have the privilege today of introducing our first speaker of the first presentation for our Spring 2019 program. Chris Collins is a product of the California Community College system. He went to Solano College years back. He went on to earn a BA and a master's degree in history from Sacramento State University. He's currently pursuing a doctorate degree from San Francisco State. He's in his first year as a tenure track faculty member with the Social Sciences Department, with the History Department, and we're happy to have him on board in that role. He's begun working with the Emoja learning community, and he's our presenter for today. Today's lecture is entitled African American Resistance to Slavery in the 19th Century Antebellum South. It's also part of our Black History Month programming here at SRJC. It's going to be an exciting presentation, very insightful. I'm excited about it. I hope you are too. Please welcome Chris Collins. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, I feel like I'm yelling, so I better stop yelling. How's everyone doing? Good. I'm glad you all could come today. And before I start, I want to just say a few things. She's not here with us today, but I wanted to thank Laura Larkey for this opportunity to present. She came to me last semester and she said, "Do you want to do a presentation?" And I was thinking, oh, a presentation in front of your class? Sure. And I'm here with like 200 people. So I do want to say thank you to Laura Larkey for providing this opportunity. She's a wonderful colleague, a wonderful historian, and just a great person. I am a historian, so I have my bachelor's and my master's in history. I got that from Sacramento State, but I also consider myself a social justice educator. The idea of history being extremely important, but I like to take history to the next level where we are able to also think about what it means to us today and how it applies to us. And so today, I encourage you to think about what I'm talking about and consider what it means to you. And so there is a philosophy that I use in my class. Some of you have taken my class or are currently taking my class. You know this philosophy, and it's called the Pedagogy of Real Talk. The idea that in order for us to be successful, in order for us to understand history, we have to do it in an authentic sort of way. So that's what the realness is, the idea that we need to be authentic, our authentic selves. But we also need to have dialogue. And in order to have that dialogue, we might have to be vulnerable. That means it's okay to have a little bit of emotion. If I say something that's funny, go ahead and laugh. I'm okay with that. If I say something that just gets to your feelings, go ahead and let it hit your feelings. But it's about us being able to communicate with each other about the topic African American resistance to slavery in the 19th century. And so I give you permission to be your authentic self today, and I'm going to go ahead and be my authentic self today. Is that okay? Yes. All right. If it wasn't okay, oh well. All right. So I will dedicate this lecture to Dr. Shirley Ann Wilson Moore. She is my favorite history professor ever. She is a professor of history emeritus at Sacramento State University. And when I took her class, I was in my bachelor's program, and this was my first time taking an African American history class. So obviously I'm African American, and I'm sitting in this class, and she's telling me all this stuff I've never heard before, and I'm just like, yeah, this is good. And I was listening to her and the information that she said, and one of the things that she kept repeating over and over again, not gonna lie, I took her class 3 other times, but what she kept saying over and over again is this statement: you can never talk about slavery or any form of dehumanization without speaking about the resistance. I'm going to say that one more time. You can never talk about slavery or any form of dehumanization without speaking about the resistance. And these words stuck with me. It stuck with me in my bachelor's program. It stuck with me in my master's program. This idea of when horrible things happen, when we have horrible things in our society, it's important to acknowledge that they are horrible, but to also talk about the resistance and to give power and credit to that resistance. I've also done some shameless advertising here, so if you're interested in any of her books, they are on the screen. Feel free to take pictures. So slavery in the 19th century had a name, had a phrase that went along with it. And so in the 19th century, because slavery was such a harsh word, it was such a bad word to say in the 19th century, oftentimes you will find politicians, you will find abolitionists, you'll find writers that call it our peculiar institution. They didn't want to say the word slavery. Instead, they said our peculiar institution. It was a euphemism for the word slavery, which they thought was too harsh or so harsh to say. And so when you think about the term peculiar, you think about strange, you think about weird. One of my students described it as crazy AF. And that was the way to describe slavery in this time period. It was a euphemism that they were trying to understand by calling it a strange institution. Now, we use euphemisms all the time. You're actually very familiar with euphemisms. Your English instructors, Dr. Rome, euphemisms come up as you're doing the reading. And so one of the euphemisms that we often use in our society has to do with death. So let's say, God forbid, you have to go to the hospital and your grandmother has died. When they encounter you, they usually don't say, your grandma's dead. They usually like to use a euphemism for death. They will say, your grandmother's no longer with us. Your grandmother has passed away. By saying passed away, by saying no longer with us, it's a euphemism for something that's harsh, for something that maybe you don't want to say directly. And so this helps us understand slavery in this time period. There's other euphemisms that people use in society. Instead of saying someone is short, you can use a euphemism like they are vertically challenged. I don't think that sounds very good, but you could say that. I've heard some horrible ones that historians use and people that describe the killings of others. Instead of saying genocide, they say ethnic cleansing, which is seen as a euphemism for genocide. Let me bring it a little bit closer back to those of you who are Generation Z and those of you who are very young millennials. Around 2015, 2016, y'all used to use this euphemism. You would text this euphemism, you would tell your parents this euphemism, you would use it all the time, and I didn't really understand what it was, but it was the euphemism Netflix and chill. What I found out is that maybe Netflix was on in the background, but what you were doing was not chill. It was hot, heavy, steamy, but it was not chill. Some of you are like, oh, now I know what my kid was doing. But it's a euphemism. It's a euphemism for something that maybe you don't want to say, you're afraid to say, you might get in trouble for saying. And in this time period, they are calling slavery their peculiar institution because slavery is really horrible. It's really awful in this time period. So let's look at how horrible and how awful slavery was before we start talking about the resistance. And so, like I said, I like to do some shameless advertising just to show you that I've read a few books in my lifetime, but also give credit for historians that are digging and trying to search and find the truth inside of history. And so, historian Jennifer L. Morgan, who's a professor of history at New York University, wrote a wonderful book called Laboring Women. And inside this book, she discusses how dehumanizing slavery was to women. Women in this time period have no control over their reproduction. During enslavement, they have no control over their reproduction. In her findings, Jennifer L. Morgan reveals that slave owners would write in their wills that the future offspring of women would be given to family members before the children were ever born. So the slave owner would write in his will, I bequeath to my oldest son, Sally's first child. I bequeath to my next son, Sally's second child. And they would give away 10 of Sally's children, and Sally wouldn't even be old enough to have children. And they're already starting to separate the children from her body, completely taking control of her reproduction and of her children. Women were raped. During slavery, there is no such thing as consensual sex. And so women were considered property as part of enslavement. And so women were raped by slave owners, by the family members of slave owners. Even enslaved men were encouraged to rape women, according to the findings of Jennifer L. Morgans. And so this shows how problematic and how dehumanizing slavery was to women. Essentially, the bodies of women that were enslaved were used to breed and reproduce the future generations of enslaved people, treating enslaved women and their reproductive organs like cattle. And so how bad was slavery? How peculiar was slavery? How crazy AF was slavery? Well, when we look at women, we're able to see how bad slavery and how awful slavery was. So other historians talk about the dehumanization that occurred in slavery. And so Stephanie Smallwood, professor of history at the University of Washington, wrote a book called Saltwater Slavery. And she investigates how dehumanization occurred on board the slave ship. In her book, if you're trying to find the thesis in her book, she refuses to call the voyages between Africa and the Americas the Middle Passage. She says that is too transitory. She calls it saltwater slavery because of how brutal and how dehumanizing that trip across the Atlantic Ocean was. Enslaved people were packed on board the slave ships as tightly as possible so the captain of the ship could make maximum profit. Enslaved women on board the ship were often kept separate, and the reason why was so that the captain and crew would have access to them. They would be raped, they would be sexually assaulted, and the men who were in separate compartments, they would hear the screams of their daughters, of their mothers, of their sisters, and their wives, but could do nothing to help them because they were chained in a separate compartment. Disease ran rampant on board the slave ship. Diseases like malaria, diseases like yellow fever, smallpox, measles, scurvy, dysentery. These are all the things that are happening on board the slave ship. These diseases plagued the enslaved people as they made the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, and these voyages could last as long as half a year, 6 months. Walter Johnson continues investigating this idea of the dehumanization of slavery, showing us how bad it is. And Walter Johnson's book, Soul by Soul, Walter Johnson is a professor of history at Harvard University. His book, Soul by Soul, discussed the commodification of human bodies on the auction blocks and the courtrooms of the 19th century United States South. Humans were put on auction blocks as merchandise. Their skins were oiled. Their hair was dyed black. They would touch the men and women to see if they could have children. And you guys can think about what that means. Sometimes taking them into the back room and doing unimaginable things to violate their bodies. Degrading the bodies of the enslaved people as property for sale is another aspect of how dehumanizing slavery was. I'll give you one more example. And for me, this is the example that hits home. Dehumanizing children. William Keane, professor of history at the University of Missouri, she wrote a book in 1995 called Stolen Childhood. And what this reveals in this time period is how children experienced enslavement. Now, the international slave trade is going to stop in 1809. And so what that means is that the majority of the people that are enslaved in the 19th century were born in enslavement. They started out in enslavement as children. And so being enslaved from birth, they're going to experience things that dehumanize them as children. In our society, we would probably call it child abuse. Children were dehumanized in many ways. Children were forced to drink from troughs. Children were given minimal clothing. Children were required to start working at very young ages. They were required and encouraged to sleep with each other. They were even encouraged to share beds with the master and the master's wife, and we can imagine what would go on, especially when they would say these children were their pets. It is not a far stretch to imagine the molestation and the abuse of children physically, emotionally, sexually, and mentally. So I honestly, before reading the information from Wilma King's book, I never honestly thought about the children in enslavement. I usually only thought about the adults. But reading this book, it really shows how tragic many of the lives of children would be. And I never really thought about the mental anguish until one of my students, and this was when I was teaching at Skyline College in San Bruno, one of my students, I make my students in African American history give a real talk of their own. And he ended up presenting, he gave a quote to the class. I think it was like a Frederick Douglass quote about oppression and how there's struggles that you have in your life, but you have to overcome those struggles. And then he said that this quote resonated with him because he could see his own life experience inside the life experience of enslaved children. And so I started thinking, like, how is this possible for him in the 21st century to imagine this, to have some sort of mental anguish and be able to see some similarity between his life and the life of enslaved children? And so he started talking about how he is a citizen of the United States, but his parents, who were born in Peru, were undocumented inside the United States. And so I continued listening to him as he gave his presentation, and he said, I leave my house in the morning, wave goodbye to my mother, wave goodbye to my father. I come to college, I go to work, but especially since 2016, he says, I always worry that when I come home at night, I won't see my parents. He says, I don't know if ICE will come in to their place of employment, come into my neighborhood, and take my parents away from me. And he said, this is how I feel like enslaved children must have felt. They never knew if their mom, their dad could be sold at some point. And so when he spoke those words, it showed that there is this connection between these experiences that we sometimes even have today and the experiences of enslaved people. And this is why I think it is so important. It is so important to think about not only these experiences and how we can connect to these experiences, but also to understand that people did survive these experiences. So the purpose of my talk today is not to talk about how bad slavery was, although it was truly awful. My purpose is to demonstrate that despite the horror and atrocities, there were many survivors. And I have to say that I am here today because there were survivors. Some of you are here today because there were survivors. How do you survive slavery? How do you survive anything that is dehumanizing? The way to survive slavery was to resist it. And so, classic format, I decided to get a definition of resistance that can make us think about what does resistance mean to us and what does it mean to people in this time period. So resistance, by definition, is the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument, the ability not to be affected by something, especially adversely. And so when we think about resistance, we can use all of these definitions together. We can use a portion of these definitions, but everyone who survived slavery, no matter how you look at this definition, everyone who survived slavery at some point in time, they resisted. If they didn't, they would have given up and died. All humans, I believe that all humans demonstrate their humanity in some form of resistance. And it's crucial to participate in resistance in order to survive slavery. So let's talk about some of the resistance. Let's get to some of the good stuff. Resistance. So there are two types of resistance. There is overt resistance and there is covert resistance. So I'm going to start with the obvious type of resistance, and then we'll go to the one that's not so obvious, but I think is pretty good. So overt resistance. The obvious way of overtly resisting is by running away. The obvious way of overtly resisting is starting slave revolts. And so what we're going to see in the 19th century is people overtly resisting. They overtly resist by running away. They work all day out in the field. They're picking cotton. The master hears them singing songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and they're singing and they're humming. And then all of a sudden, the master wakes up the next day and they're gone. They were resisting. They were saying, I must flee for my life. I have to take my children with me, and I need to go and find a place of safety. And that was their way of overtly resisting slavery. Anyone ever hear of Harriet Tubman? All right. Your third grade education has done you well. I'm just kidding. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is a significant individual, conductor of the Underground Railroad, taking people, helping people get to their freedom and resisting. And she did this despite having a mental illness in regards to her narcolepsy, but she was still able to help many people successfully embrace this idea of resistance. Another area of resistance, overt resistance, is going to be starting slave revolts. Now, slave revolts in the 19th century were dangerous. If you were going to start a slave revolt, you had to do the planning. All the planning had to be done in secret. You had to go to one plantation, tell everyone there, hey, this is what we're going to do. Go to the next plantation, tell everyone this is what we're going to do. And so the most famous slave revolt in the 19th century is going to be the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion. The Nat Turner Slave Rebellion has, of course, been produced by filmmakers in 2016. That's the clip that you see on the screen. I encourage you to watch it. Gruesome, but it is a depiction of history that you will never forget. But Nat Turner was a preacher, and he embraced his Christianity. He embraced the Bible scriptures that said that we should run away. We should be free. A lot of the Old Testament scriptures of freeing yourself from bondage, freeing yourself from Pharaoh's grip. And so starting this slave revolt is going to involve going around the countryside and killing whites that they encountered. And so it's estimated that they killed up to 65 whites as part of this slave revolt. However, like I said, these slave revolts are dangerous. And with any sort of resistance, there are consequences. And we'll talk about the consequences as we go through these ideas of resistance. But there are consequences. And one of the consequences of the Nat Turner's slave revolt is that more African Americans are going to be killed than whites killed as they retaliate, as they subdue this slave rebellion. And so these are two examples of overt resistance that we're going to see in this time period of enslavement: running away overtly and starting slave revolts. Now, imagine that you were in the 19th century. Imagine that you were in that time period. Which one would you do if you had option A or B? Would you run away? Would you start a slave revolt? Or would you need option C? Some of you are like, I need option C, please. All of the above. Option C, covert resistance. So overt resistance is in your face. You can't deny that overt resistance is happening. One day the owner wakes up, boom, everyone's gone. Overt resistance. One day the owner looks out his window and there are a bunch of people running towards his house. That's overt resistance. You can tell that it's happening. You can calculate how many times it occurred inside of enslavement. But covert resistance, the resistance that you cannot calculate, is going to be how many people survived slavery in this time period. And a lot of times we don't even think about the covert resistance and how much it played into an enslaved person's life on a daily basis. One way of covertly resisting is working slowly. So if your master told you to go out into the fields and pick 5 bushels of cotton, you could say, yes, sir. Yes, master. I'm going to go ahead and pick that cotton for you. But you could covertly resist. And I have to imagine how I would do it. I'd probably walk out into the field of cotton, see all the little cotton growing up on the little plants, and I need to covertly resist today. So I'd probably go by and say, 1 cotton ball, put it in the bag. 2 cotton balls, I probably wouldn't even get half a bag done in the day, because I would covertly resist by working slowly. And people did this during this time period of enslavement. Now, going back to consequences, could there be consequences? Absolutely. Your master could whip you. He could say, you know what, you didn't pick enough today. But he also might think, wow, I'm trying to make you do too much work. I need to make sure that you only pick 1 bag. And so you would covertly resist. Another example of covertly resisting could be breaking tools. You see a tool that you always have to use to plow the field, you can go and break it. If no one sees you, the master doesn't know if the tool broke on its own. Perhaps it was old and it was going to break anyways. Maybe a cow stepped on the tool, but you covertly resisted. You broke that tool that you would have had to use to continue working on the plantation. Now, I know some of you guys are thinking about this because y'all have jobs, and you're thinking, oh yeah, when my boss tells me to get off the clock, I know, I used to work in the restaurant, I'm like, I'm gonna roll these silverware very slowly so I can get my overtime. Oh wait, I forgot to put the forks in. Let me unroll all these silverware and then put the fork back in. We do this. We might have done this with our parents. Oh, Mom, the toaster broke. I don't know how it broke. I might have dropped it on the ground a few times. But that covert resistance, enslaved people would do this, and there's no way to count how often people covertly resisted. In Darlene Clark Hines' book, it's actually a textbook that I use in my classroom, I found one of the best examples of covert resistance. The best example of covert resistance that I could possibly find inside of this book. So she goes through this whole list, people mistreating animals, destroying crops, poisoning the master, stealing. Some women even committed abortion. Some women were thinking, you know what, I would rather make sure my children do not have to live the same life that I'm living, so I'm gonna go ahead and abort the fetus so I don't have to continue to perpetuate enslavement. And that was a way of covertly resisting enslavement in this time period. But Darlene Clark Hines, who is an emeritus professor at Kent State University, she found this primary source example of a woman who covertly resists. And when I looked at that example, I just couldn't believe how accurate it depicted the resistance and how possible this resistance was in the time period. So this woman, she had been enslaved all of her life. But in 1865, Civil War's over, she is now free. And for the past 15 years, while she was enslaved, she cooked breakfast, she cooked lunch, she cooked dinner every single day for the master and the master's family. Every single day for the past 15 years, she had been cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But it's 1865, slavery's over, Civil War's done, she is free, and this is the last breakfast that she has to make. This is the last time that she has to do this for this family. She is free, she's no longer enslaved. And so she cooked her normal breakfast routine, got everything all together, placed it all out on the table. She took off her apron, and she told the master and his wife, she told them about her covert resistance. She felt brave enough, she knew that she was done being enslaved, and so she told them about her covert resistance. She looked at each one of them in the eye, and she said, I've been enslaved to you for the past 15 years. And for the past 15 years that I've been enslaved to you, every single morning, I've been spitting in your coffee, and I've been pissing in your biscuits. And she left. Now think about this. For the past 15 years, she had covertly resisted. Every single morning for breakfast, she had covertly resisted. Did it give her her freedom after the first time, after the second time, after the 10th time, after the 300,000th time? Did it give her her freedom? No. But she resisted. Every single morning, I can imagine a smile on her face as the master is getting his cup of coffee. And he's looking, he's saying, wow, there's a lot of bubbles in here today. Steamy coffee. And goes ahead and takes a sip. I can imagine her giggling to herself when she sees the master's wife biting into a buttermilk biscuit, and all of a sudden the butter supposedly is dripping down her face, and she says, "Oh, wow, there's so much butter this morning." She covertly resisted, didn't give her freedom. But every single day she thought about, how am I going to survive slavery today? How am I going to survive slavery tomorrow? I'm going to do this by covertly resisting. This is getting me through the day. This is causing me to survive. And it's the way that she was able to survive slavery. And so it's important to think about these ideas of resistance, whether they are overt, whether they are covert. And so, like I told you, I'm a historian, but I also like to be a social justice educator. And when we think about resistance, we can make it relevant to ourselves today in the 21st century. When we think about resistance today, we can think about it in regards to political action that maybe you will decide to take in your future. You might decide, I'm going to run for office, and I'm going to take some political action, and that's going to be my way of resistance. You might decide to do some peaceful protest. You might decide to join a march as a way to participate in the resistance. Some of you might decide to do civil disobedience, but that might be your way of embracing some form of resistance. You may do it overtly, you may do it covertly. I have images here that give you an idea of possible ways of resistance, ways that we've seen in our society today. But remember, regardless of how you decide to resist, just like people during enslavement, there are consequences to resistance. There's consequences to resistance, but I think there's also a legacy you leave behind when you do resist, okay? So there are consequences to resisting, but there's also a legacy that you leave behind when you do resist. So I'll leave you with this last story. There was a young African-American male. He was 17 years old, and he lived in Oakland. Anybody from Oakland? Anyone been to Oakland? All right, I'm among my peeps. 17-year-old man, young man, lived in Oakland, and I'm gonna call him RJ. His initials were RJ. Everyone called him RJ. And RJ, yes, he was from the hood. Yes, he was from the streets, but he was very intelligent. He was a smart young man, smart young African-American man. He was very thoughtful. He was a polite young man. He was also very protective. You could count on RJ for almost anything. So I was told about RJ from one of my colleagues at SF State. We're both in a cohort together. And she told the entire cohort about RJ. And she said, RJ was part of the resistance. RJ would stand up for people that other people would bully. RJ would make sure to make friends with people who didn't have friends. RJ would be probably everyone's friend in this room just because he was the type of person that wanted you to feel good about yourself. RJ, 17 years old, living in Oakland. One day he was walking several girls home from school, and RJ, being the typical protective person that he was, a car drove by. And this car drove by, and the driver inside of the car said some derogatory things to the girls that RJ was walking with. And RJ, being the protective person that he is, he said something back. He didn't like the mistreatment that was happening, the harassment that was happening to the young women that he was walking home that day. And RJ ended up losing his life to gun violence on the streets of Oakland. RJ that day resisted. And RJ ended up suffering the consequence of resistance. But I don't tell you that story just because it's a sad story. I tell you that story because what RJ left behind was he left behind a legacy of resistance. So my colleague, She was in Oakland at the time. She was heartbroken that RJ had been shot and killed. She was at the funeral, but it changed her mission. She saw that what she did and the resistance that she was promoting among young people, that it was something that she had to push even further. And so she took what had started there in Oakland, California, and she went down to Los Angeles. And she started pushing forward with her restorative justice practices there. She was successful there in Los Angeles, and now she's working in San Diego. RJ, losing his life on that day at the age of 17 in Oakland, consequence of resistance. But what he left behind was a legacy of resistance. During the time period of 19th century enslavement, my ancestors were dehumanized, they struggled. However, they resisted both overtly and they resisted covertly. Their resistance and the consequence of their resistance is the legacy of resistance that allows me to stand before you today. I think it's so important for us to continue to remember and acknowledge that we are the legacy of resistance. Thank you, everyone. Are there any questions? I think that's supposed to do questions and answers now. I'm like, I need a tissue, actually. Any questions? Yes, I'm not quite Dr. Collins yet, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But I'll answer.
How do you, as an African-American teacher in Sonoma County, resist? You may ask.
Whew. I thought we were going to get the softball questions first. Oh, you want some real talk. Yes, I can. So as an African-American instructor in Sonoma County, how do I resist? Was that the question? All right. Thank you for allowing me time to think about that one, too. So understand that I started off in community college like most of you. And one of the things that I'm working on in my doctoral program is I'm looking at the institutional microaggressions, and actually I'm going to change it so it says aggressions, that happen to specifically men of color who attend community college. And so my research is looking at those examples of how, on a day-to-day basis, people who are minoritized and marginalized by our society are experiencing that same here inside of the community college setting. And so what do I personally do? I can't, I'm not president of the college. I'm not the vice president of academic affairs. I can't stop all that from going on, although one day I might be in that role and I might be able to do more. But inside of my classroom, what I try to do is I try to make sure that the students who are in my classroom, they can be their authentic self. You don't have to pretend to be someone that you're not inside of my classroom. In my classroom, be your authentic self, and we can work from there. Because oftentimes, when people do feel like they're minoritized, when people do feel like they're marginalized, it's because there is some oppressive power figure that is doing something, and oftentimes it might be something unintentional, but doing something that's preventing them from being successful. And so I try to make sure to say, you who you are can be successful in my classroom, and take what you learn from my classroom and be your authentic self in the next classroom. And as I move up the ladder, hopefully I can start doing more, but in my classroom, I can control what I do. And a lot of times what I do is I embrace something called the pedagogy of confidence. And the pedagogy of confidence, some of you guys have heard in my class, the pedagogy of confidence is the belief that every single one of the students in my class, they have the ability and the intelligence to successfully pass my class. And one day I'm waiting for an entire class that's gonna make an A. That's what I'm waiting for one day. But everyone has the ability to pass. And so it's that belief in students. That answer the question kind of, sort of? Okay. Thank you for asking that question. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in whether or not you've done any research on independent African communities, such as the Maroons in Jamaica. Do you have any information in terms of, in America, those independent resistors that happen here?
So Excellent question. So the question was, do I have any information or have I done any personal research on independent African groups that resisted? And so unfortunately, I haven't done research in that area. However, one of the most famous resistances that's going to occur in the 19th century, and they were successful, is going to be the resistance that occurs in Haiti. This idea of overthrowing the French government. And so I would love to do more in that area, but that is a deficit on my part. And so understanding more would definitely just increase my capacity to better identify resistance. Absolutely. Because when we think about resistance, you know, it's everyone. Everyone has a story of resistance. And so whether you're African, African American, Native American, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, there's all these forms of resistance. I mean, even America, we got started on resistance, Revolutionary War, civil disobedience. Wow, now we're so docile and quiet. But yeah, this idea of the resistance, and it's area to expand, absolutely. Any other questions? Yes, my colleague, Ann Donegan. Yes.
And when I do that, my students and I always grapple with Linda Brent telling us that she wasn't sexually assaulted. And I know that's a big, point of contention among
Right.
some scholars. I hadn't read that book, Stolen Childhood, that you put up there.
Yeah.
So I'll put it on my list. What have you heard about that?
So,
What does Dr. King say?
yeah. So the question was, in the historical profession, there are disputes over whether it's possible for an African-American woman that's enslaved, whether it's possible for her to be in a consensual relationship with a man that is white, that is free. Is that possible? And so for me, what I do is I draw upon historians like Deborah Gray White, who says, you know, there's just no way, when you even look at the legal records in the time period, there is no way to say that this is a consensual relationship. Think about it this way. If you are enslaved, you are property. Think about what you own today as property, and this is the example I always use. Your car. Your car doesn't consent to drive you. You get in the car and you say, I'm gonna drive. And so taking that same idea with slavery, this idea that you may feel like you are enamored with somebody, but how much is that really true love when both people would be considered equals, when both people would be considered free in society? And so there's this unevenness that I think historians like Deborah Gray White would argue that there's just this unevenness in regards to the relationship. And so if there were some more equality there, it could perhaps be seen more as consensual, but and some of it might even be our 21st century ideas being placed on them. The idea that perhaps in perspective, they were like, this is the best I could do. But when we think about it, there's just such an inequality among those relationships. And what does that mean? Even in this time period, the 19th century, with women, regardless of race, just women in general, and that inequality that they're experiencing and being viewed as property. It's quite the, I don't want to call it the cluster F, but that's kind of what it is. Yes?
Have you done any research, or do you know any research about resistance in different states and counties? Let's say Northern California, Southern California, East Texas, and just in terms of, I know that African Americans have a green book when they travel.
Mm. First of all, the Green Book. Let me repeat the question. So what about other resistance in other parts? Have I done further research about resistance in other parts of the United States? And then the Green Book, the locations where you could go, hotels and restaurants that would accept you as an African American. So my resistance, things that I focused on resistance typically are the 19th century, specifically in that antebellum South, because that's where I originate from. I'm from Louisiana. But there are, when we think about the resistance and the legacies of resistance, there's resistance all over. And so one of the things to look at is the resistance that occurs here in the Bay Area in the 20th century. Y'all are all familiar with the Black Panthers? That is resistance. That's a community service organization that says we need to protect our communities. That's a community service organization that says we're college educated, so we're gonna build healthcare clinics inside of our community to keep people safe. They're building things like the breakfast program to make sure that children that are going to school hungry are going to be able to effectively get through their studies and be able to focus. So I'm more familiar with maybe more of the more common ideas of resistance, and those would be areas of further research are on the county and the local areas in regards to how people resist. Now, of course, we also have the small African-American communities that would spring up, and those are their own factions of resistance, I would argue, as they're building settlements and places of their own. Absolutely. Yes?
Thank you. It's an excellent
Thank you.
very much. Thank you. And today, slavery is it's in the jails. It's in the jails. I mean, nationwide.
Yeah.
Sometimes when my English is not good.
Oh, no, I understand.
Myself in English.
Yeah.
So slavery today is in the jail institution, prisons. So and these individuals, they are, they don't. I would like to hear from you how they resist, what we can do to help them to resist this systematic slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is this idea that when we think about slavery, 19th century, think about slavery on a plantation, but today when we think about slavery, we can look at a prison system that's incarcerating people of color at larger numbers than other groups, essentially criminalizing their lives. And what can we do as a way to participate in that resistance today? What could they do as a way to participate in that resistance? And this is one of the things that I personally have struggled with and battled with. My father was in the military for 20 years, served in the United States Air Force. But then he did 15 years after that working inside of a prison. And it provided wonderful employment opportunities for him, overtime on top of overtime. But thinking about what that meant in regards to the people that were located there. And the people, some of them located inside of that prison that had a justice system that failed them. What can we do? And this is where I go to the idea of we have to be in positions of power, political power, where we can make legislation that changes. And I think our governor is starting in the right path, this idea of trying to decrease the incarceration rate, making sure that people who are in jail for drugs are not being incarcerated and put away and essentially losing their lives. And so I think there's a legislative angle that we are capable of doing. And then inside the institution, there's things that we can do as inside the institution. So one of the things that I would love to do in my future is I would love to be one of those instructors who goes into a prison and teaches people that are inside of the prison. Why do we have this fear of trying to educate people? Oftentimes, if people were educated, they could probably prevent them from going to prison. And so I think that when someone is behind bars, it's about this process of rehabilitation and seeing what we can do in regards to making their lives better. So if on a personal level, it's teaching inside of a prison, that's something that could happen, but then also on the legislative level and making sure that we vote for people that are going to look at prisons, look at incarceration, and making sure our vote counts. You guys are asking awesome questions. Yes?
Okay, so as our country becomes more diverse and more immigrants come to this country, what do you think is an appropriate way to discuss the resistance within the African diaspora?
Yeah.
Without stepping on the toes of African Americans and not trying to steal your shine.
I love it. Yes, so the question was, so as our country becomes more diverse, as we get more and more people inside of our country, how do we make sure that when we talk about the African-American diaspora, we don't step on each other's toes? And so I'm going to tell you a story. So at Sac State, I had a lot of good instructors at Sac State. So I'm not trying to tell you all to go to Sac State, but I know you guys have Sonoma State down the street, but Sac State's pretty bomb. But at Sacramento State, I had an instructor. She was from South Africa. She spoke like 5 different languages, so smart, so amazing. But she said when she got here to the United States, she went to UC Berkeley. And when she went to UC Berkeley, an African-American student went up to her. So she's African. An African-American student went up to her and said, "You're the reason why my ancestors were enslaved." And she was like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, I didn't sell you personally, you know. And so there was this kind of contention that came up. And I think this is kind of one of those products that you're talking about as part of this question. And so one of the things that I always say is understand that we have to listen to each other. And we have to make sure that we incorporate all of these elements of history together, because one perspective doesn't mean that all the other perspectives are wrong. It means that we need to add a piece to that perspective and say, this is the perspective of someone that is African that's coming to the country, trying to, as a new immigrant to the country, trying to make meaning of that. And then also the idea that there are African Americans here who, in some ways, are trying to find out their own identity. And so how can we participate together in trying to form our identities and make them strong together? And so I think this is something that we have to think about a lot inside of the Bay Area, inside of the diverse communities that we have in the Bay Area. Excellent question. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was raised in the Washington, D.C. area.
Washington, D.C.
And elders in our community told us about, I think it was Bump Fridays that happened in, I believe it was the 40s and 50s, where African-American people would purposely bump into Caucasians and kind of, create a little bit of a stir.
Uh-huh.
However, they also taught us that there was a different vehicle, and that was oftentimes music.
Yeah.
My generation really came up with a lot of forms of punk rock, hip hop, reggae. These were really a big catalyst for resistance in my generation.
Right.
And I'm just curious if you're seeing how that is maybe modified or changed now.
So excellent question. The question is the idea of, and I'm going to kind of summarize it, the idea of how do maybe even the 20th century we see resistance, specifically when we think about pop culture, when we think about music, and we think about entertainment. And then you also said the word commodify, which is so interesting and tricky there. But I think when we think about how we can all come together, music is a great way for all of us to come together. For whatever reason, you have people that are playing songs that resonate. I mean, when we talk about love, love is just a song that resonates across cultures. When we talk about family, songs about family resonates across cultures. So there are these places and these spheres where we find commonality. And I think that as we move forward, we have to think about those places where we do connect, where we maybe do bump into each other, because that we have those same feelings, we have those same emotions. I'm human, you're human. Why can't we connect somehow? And so I'm not sure how that will look in the future. If I had a show of hands of how many people have listened to Cardi B this morning, I'm not sure how that all connects. But I think that when we think about resistance, we have to think about how it can maybe have multiple layers. And maybe there's a layer of entertainment. Maybe there's a layer of politics. Maybe there's a layer of education and instruction. And so maybe all of these layers of resistance based upon what you do well. So if you're a musician, that might be your form of resistance. If you are someone that is a writer, your form of resistance would be through writing. But if we all resisted together, what kind of beautiful world could we possibly see? Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I've been living in Sonoma County for about 10 years, and one of the things that I found that you standing on the stage there and talking to us about what you're talking about is a form of covert resistance.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
I do have one.
Yes.
I was wondering, a long time ago, with how rap music changed, and then the NWA changed their free speech songs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a big difference then now? Is that really different than?
So I'm not as caught up on new school rap. Is that what it is? New school rap versus old school rap. But old school rap was all about a resistance. And if you guys think about songs like Fight the Power and things like that, these are all about resistance. And so understanding that what we connect to rap music today, if it's more materialistic, it may not be as much of resistance as much as saying, now I want to start embracing American culture. I want to embrace American prosperity. But the idea is that it's still about resistance in regards to the language and the words that are being used. And there are some great rap artists that do embrace the resistance. Any other questions? Yes?
As regards to resistance in the 20th century, who do you feel like had more of an impact, Martin Luther King or Malcolm X? I read Angela Davis'
Y'all trying to get me in trouble today.
book, and she says that in order for true change to happen, that the movement has to be militaristic, and to me, that's more like Malcolm X.
Yeah.
So I feel like, I mean, what's your opinion on this?
I mean, you're not trying to coax me into the question and the answer, but no, okay, so the question was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Which one more powerful, which one, is pushing for that resistance? I do think, and so I will say in general, resistance can be done differently depending on where you're located. In the South, you may not be able to have some overt resistance and fighting back because the South is notorious for lynching and things of that nature. And so Martin Luther King, where he was located in the South, probably was a perfect product for that. I would definitely be the Black Panther, Malcolm X side of things, just because, especially when I look at like the Black Panthers, but even Malcolm X, this idea of you can only tolerate so much brutality. There comes a point when you tell somebody, stop stepping on my foot, and they keep stepping on your foot. It's like, I gotta show you. This is how it feels, and it's not about creating violence. Yeah, it's like this is bullying. It's not about creating and intentionally starting violence, but the idea of there has to come a point where you protect yourself, you protect your own, and you make sure that you're okay, and you make sure that your family's okay. And so this is where, my parents are both from the South, and my mom's just such an advocate of Martin Luther King and just peacefully resist. And I'm like, Mom, come on, let's get some fire. And so I mean, I think depending on who you are, where you're located, understand that they're all participating in the resistance. And I think, we of course give more acknowledgement in our society to Martin Luther King. That might be intentional in a way to say peaceful resistance. Whereas Malcolm X is a genius. When you read his writings, he's an absolute genius. And this idea of this might be too volatile of a resistance that our society is not ready for.
Do you feel the United States kind of put Martin Luther King on more of a pedestal because they didn't want to go, you know what I mean?
Yes. So the question is, did we put Martin Luther King on a pedestal? I do think that he is on a pedestal, and it is more of that nonviolent approach. Like, if you are going to resist, please follow the Martin Luther King example. And I think that is kind of the right, yeah. He does have his own day, if you want to get your own day, yeah. All right, I have time for one more question, then I'm supposed to wrap up because I think it's a class, or two questions.
Hey, Chris, since you grew up in Louisiana, what do you see of, and like they had some of the runaway slaves are being with the native tribes. Do you see a lot of that down in Louisiana?
Yes, oh yeah, so Louisiana is like just culturally mixed and just Cajun people. So yeah, so even if you look at like my own family, you'll be like, ooh, like who's all up in that family? But yeah, this idea that there are the Native American mixtures, there's a French influence, there's a lot going on there, and so it's all part of that mixture.
Yeah, because I have my grandparents were born in Oklahoma.
Okay.
And my grandma, she lived on Chickasaw Reservation in Marion over there.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. A lot of them were kind of like there's like a mix of like Indian and black over there. Or you see over here, I mean, here you can like notice it, but over there it's like.
Right. It's like almost normalized. Absolutely. And there was one more question. Yes.
As we're seeing people try to whitewash and ignore parts of history or say that they don't want to deal with it because it makes them feel gross or icky or guilty, what is a good way to broach that? Because there's no way to avoid it. We should be talking about it, but we don't want to come them that comes at them combatively.
Right. So the question is, how do you talk to someone about these types of topics without them getting resentful, without them feeling, I guess, guilty? How do we approach these conversations and these topics? So I'll answer this in two ways. One way is that I think some people aren't ready for the conversation. And so one of the things that I do, I teach a race, ethnicity, and gender class here. And beginning of the semester, I do like the first 2 days where we do some activities just to see if we're all ready for this conversation. And I tell some students, you know, if you're not ready, it's okay. We can have this conversation at another time, because some people aren't ready to really delve into it and to really listen to all the different perspectives that are out there. And then I guess the second way to think about it is there a way to find an example of shared oppression? So I've often found that people don't want to talk about a topic because they're either uncomfortable with it, but they don't know that there's also experiences that they share together. And so in my History 21 class, not to give you guys the spoiler, but I guess I'll go ahead and do that. It does a great job in the book that I use. It shows how all of these minoritized groups in the United States experience a very similar form of resistance. And it's a pattern that the people in power keep doing as a way to subjugate us. And so when we find these areas of shared oppression, it allows us to say, oh, wow, they mistreated you and they mistreated us. What are we going to do to work together? And so it's like I said, it's a difficult conversation to have, and not everyone's ready for it. But I have faith that you'll be able to tear down that wall and have that conversation. All right, it is 1:03. I am willing to answer any questions one-on-one if you want to come talk to me. But have a great day, and thank you all. Yes.